Hello. So this lecture is on the philosophy of mind. It's sort of a very quick overview of some of the main ideas or theories that philosophers have come up with concerning the connection between our physical bodies and then our minds or our consciousness. And I'm following this short work by Thomas Nagel, who has written a lot of different topics in philosophy, but he was one of the first essays in philosophy that I ever read was by Thomas Nagel, and that's kind of what got me interested in this overall. So, obviously, our brains and our minds are very closely connected, but our brains are part of our bodies. So sometimes this is referred to as the mind-body problem, right? That we've got these bodies, but we've also got these conscious minds. And so what really is the connection here? So just some stage setting to start off with. Obviously, the brain and the rest of our bodies are physical. They're made up of, these biological tissues. In particular, our brains, they're made up of neurons and other kinds of supporting cells, plus the connections between neurons where information is transferred, these synapses, including the neurotransmitters that are sending the signals across the synapses and all the electrical impulses that are running down the neurons and so on. So there's this complicated interplay, this information processing that's happening on the physical level that we can study directly using scientific instruments. But then on the other side of things, we've got the mind, our conscious awareness that includes all of our thoughts, that is our conscious perceptions and our emotions, how we feel, our desires and ideas, and the memories that we can reflect on and think back as to what's happened to us in the past, and the basic concepts that we use in order to think about the world. So these seem like quite different things. The brain, as I said, it's a physical thing, so we can study it using standard scientific techniques. So it's got mass. We can measure how much mass, how much does the brain actually weigh? Typically somewhere around 3 pounds. And then it's got a certain volume to it. It exists in a particular location, right? Inside our actual skulls. And there's certain charges, positive and negative charges of the ions that are flowing around in there. We can measure all of that, and a wide variety of other physical measurements that we can do on the brain, the physical brain itself. But then on the other hand, we've got our minds, right? Our conscious awareness. It doesn't make sense to ask, how much does a feeling weigh? How much space does pain take up or love? Where is it? What's the volume of an idea? It just doesn't make sense. It seems like, as we call it, a category error. We're asking us to measure something in a way that just it's not available to be measured in that way. So it seems like we've got these very, very different things that are clearly part of us. We've got our physical side, our bodies and our brains included, but then we've got our conscious mind on the other side, and these seem like just such very different things. And this is where Rene Descartes comes into the story because he's one of the first people that we actually recognize as articulating these ideas in a very systematic way. And remember that Rene Descartes also had this, perhaps the most famous line in the history of Western philosophy, I think, therefore I am, right? That says that I am a thinking thing. So he actually starts with the mind, says like, well, here I am thinking about whether I exist. So therefore I must exist, right? I can't fail to exist, yet also think about whether I exist, because just the act of thinking about whether I exist just proves straightforwardly that I do exist. And we've got these other questions about, what's the nature of physical reality and so on. But the fundamental starting point for Descartes is I am a thinking thing. I am a mind that is currently thinking thoughts right now. So, just to kind of motivate this even more, right? Why the brain specifically? To us today, it seems kind of obvious why, we don't just talk about the mind-body problem, that we specifically talk about the mind-brain problem, right? What's the connection there? It's difficult to identify what that connection really is, how the brain supports consciousness. That's why it's referred to as a problem. But we do know at this point that the brain is the most important part of our physical bodies when it comes to talking about our conscious minds. Obviously, injuries to the brain affect our consciousness in ways that injuries to like our arm or our leg or something doesn't do, right? Obviously, you might feel the injury to your arm or your leg in your mind, but in other ways, your mind is pretty much unaffected, right? It doesn't change its ability to think in significant fundamental ways the way injuries to a brain might. And modern neuroscience clearly focuses on the brain as the seat of consciousness. So, like I said, this is going to be just kind of a quick overview of some of the major approaches to thinking about this connection between the brain and our minds, our conscious minds. And so here's the ones that we'll look at most closely. And so let's go through them. The first one is the one from Descartes. So substance dualism. Dualism, right? So there's two things, our mind and our physical bodies. And this term substance is being used in a way by Descartes that is particular to his time and place. So it might be a bit different than the way we use the term substance today. The main thing we need to be paying attention to here is that Descartes' notion of substance is something that exists, right? Some part of the universe that actually exists, but specifically, it's a part of the universe. It's a thing that it can exist on its own. It doesn't have to be connected to or supported by something else. So the physical substance, that's easier for us to understand. Physical things, especially now that we think of today where it's protons, neutrons, and electrons or whatnot, these are the physical things that can just simply exist in space. They don't need something else to be attached to in order to exist. So it's pretty straightforward from our modern scientific perspective. And these are things that, of course, we can measure with our standard scientific instruments, mass, volume, all those sorts of things. But Descartes also thought that there's this mental substance that's different from the physical substance, and it can exist on its own. In beings like us, the mental substance and the physical substance have this very interesting intertwined existence, right? They're connected in some specific way, but they don't have to be. And that's key to Descartes, is that the mental and the physical can actually come apart. So they can exist separately. So let's take a little bit closer look at this. Right? They clearly interact. Like I said, they're connected in this very significant way. But Descartes thought of the body as a purely mechanical thing, right? This is a physical, mechanical thing that we exist in, this body. And it's receiving information from the outside physical world that's around us, right? So light and sensor or smells, tastes, feeling, touching things, so we can interact with the physical world. So we're receiving these sensory inputs, and then our bodies, our physical bodies, send that information to our mind somehow, and it has a causal influence on our mind so that then we can mentally perceive that outside world and think about it and react to it, decide what to do. And then our mind comes up with some signal to send back out to the body. And so it physically interacts. It has a physical causal influence on our bodies. And then our physical body reacts to those thoughts that were being produced in our mental mind. So while the body is mechanical, the mind is not mechanical. We can't measure it in those scientific ways and figure out sort of what the causal sort of chain of events are in our minds the same way we can in our bodies, but nevertheless, they are causally interacting with one another in this way. So what are some ideas in favor, some evidence or some considerations, arguments in favor of this substance dualism from Descartes? Well, arguably, this is something like the common sense notion of the relationship between our mind and body. If we look at kind of the way people talk about their minds and their bodies, they talk about them as if they're sort of these separate things. I can talk about my brain or my mind And sometimes I might talk about those as being pretty much the same thing, but commonly we think of our mind as something just different. Even if we don't realize we're talking that way, when we really look at the way people talk, that seems to be the common sense notion that these are separate things. And going way back into antiquity, people didn't really apparently think about this too much. We don't have a lot of evidence that they really thought about this relationship between mind and body in the same way that Descartes is thinking about this relationship. Nevertheless, this seems like kind of the default assumption among people for centuries and centuries. So, in favor is Descartes' basic insight that these seem like very different things. The physical body is open to all sorts of physical measurements using scientific instruments, uh, whereas the mind is not, right? We can't measure the mass and volume and so on of mental things, the parts of our mind. It's also consistent with a wide variety of religious views that you, really, the real you, as created by a divine being, is your mind. In fact, Descartes, a more faithful translation of the term that Descartes was using would be spirit rather than mind. I use mind because that sort of gets at the more contemporary notion of what we're talking about, our conscious life, our conscious mind. But Descartes was using the term spirit. And when we use that term, the connection to religion becomes even more clear, right? After your physical body dies, your spirit lives on and can maybe exist in an afterlife. And maybe even existed before your physical body came into being, right? The divine being inserted your spirit into this physical substance and created you, who you are now, this combination of physical and mental, physical being and spiritual being. The considerations against, however, is that this interaction, one of the arguments against it anyway, is that this interaction between your physical parts and your mental parts, it seems to be fundamentally mysterious, right? So my physical body is having a causal influence on my mind. So what is that causal influence? What is that causation? Is it physical causation, the kind that we study in science? Well, if so, how can physical causation have an effect on the purely mental mind? Going the other direction, right? How does the mind physically cause things to happen in the body? Is it mental causation of some sort? What is that exactly? How do we measure it? It just seems a fundamentally mysterious causal interaction between the mental substance and the physical substance. Plus, it's very much fallen out of favor with contemporary science, really starting, at least in the 1800s, but then, as we'll talk about, by the early, especially into the mid 20th century, it very much fallen out of favor. This idea that there's this fundamentally unmeasurable mental substance that forms our consciousness, that forms our mind, that's just outside the realm of science. Typically, if scientists can't measure it, they just kind of ignore it. In fact, they might even go so far as to say that it just doesn't exist. It's sort of nonsense to even talk about something that we can't measure. Plus, as I was just saying, it's got this connection to religion. If we think of our mind instead of as our spirit, well, that's got a direct connection to religious ideas. And especially once we're starting to move into the 20th century, science was trying hard to kind of shed its connections to religion and those kind of unmeasurable or unfalsifiable notions that came from religion and try to focus just on the here and now, what's physically in front of us that we can measure. So these are some reasons that it became, it sort of fell out of style, so to speak, substance dualism. And really, folks ended up moving on to focusing just on the physical, not surprisingly, given the rise of science. But before we get to that one, I want to focus on this other thing, mental monism, which as the term suggests, monism is that there's just one thing. But interestingly, this idea that how popular was it? Let the historians decide that. But at least it was around in the 1700s, at least. That's where we get a lot of the authors that talk about this. One of the most famous ones being George Berkeley. So Berkeley thought that the only substance that actually exists is mental substance, interestingly, that instead of the physical substance being kind of the primary substance that makes up the universe, there just is nothing physical. Everything is mental. We are only minds. We sort of think of ourselves as having a physical body, but really it's just everything's existing in our minds. And even that is a misleading way of phrasing it, because it's not that everything exists in our minds, it's that just that everything just is mental substance. What are some reasons in favor of this admittedly somewhat odd view? At least from our perspective, it seems odd. Well, part of it comes from considerations that are from a different lecture that I recorded, the one on skepticism. External world skepticism starts with this notion that really the only thing that we directly are aware of is our minds, our mental perceptions that we're having. And we assume that there's a physical world out there that's causing us to have the perceptions that we have. But that's an extra step, right? We have to justify that assumption somehow. And that's notoriously difficult, perhaps even impossible, to 100% guarantee that there actually is a physical world out there, and that the characteristics of that physical world are what are causing our perceptions to be what they are. So rather than trying to take that extra step to justify and assume that there actually is an external physical world, we just stop at the first step, which is that we definitely have minds, right? We're a thinking thing, and we're having certain perceptions. And so maybe that's it. All right. So this mental sensory data is the only thing we know exists. So maybe that's all that actually does exist. Reasons against, well, we could talk about the uh, contemporary physical science perspective that just says like this doesn't make much sense. But one specific thing that we can talk about, even that seems difficult to account for, even within this theory of mental monism, is where are we? Right? If we assume that there's this physical world between you and me when we're interacting with each other, I'm sending sound waves right up. My mind is causing my mouth, my vocal cords, and so on to vibrate in a certain way, and those vibrations go through the air and eventually hit your ears, and then you pick up on what I'm saying. But if there's no physical substrate between us, how are we interacting? How do we communicate? Where are we, right? We're, according to mental monism, we're not minds existing in a physical reality. It's like everything is just mental. So what is this place exactly? And so, I'll leave it up to you to think about, like, where are we? What is the world? Okay, so on to the physical stuff, which is more the contemporary idea. So definitely rising only once we started to get a better handle on what the physical body is made of, especially what the brain is made of. So the assumption here, as the term suggests, physical monism, the physical substance is the only substance. The only things that exist are physical things. And the Enlightenment was really when science started to come into its full strength, and the culture, especially Western Europe and the Americas and so on, started to embrace the scientific viewpoint. So they were focusing just on what could be measured and shared. Remember when we talk about empirical evidence, that is evidence that we can detect using our sensory systems, but it's also public. That is, other people will also perceive this evidence in the same way. And it's really only when we have physical stuff that's sort of right there in front of us that we can measure in standardized ways that we can call this empirical evidence. So this eliminates kind of the mysterious and undetectable, unmeasurable mental substance, which is also associated with religious notions. And so this is science in its attempt to be more hard-headed, right? Like to be more strict in the way that it's evaluating what exists and how that stuff that exists actually works. So there's a wide variety of variations on physicalism or physical monism. I'll at least briefly mention one of the early popular versions of it here that came to prominence, especially in the mid 20th century, called behaviorism. And if you've taken a psychology class, maybe you've heard of behaviorism before. And as I've already said, this is focusing on what's measurable, what's directly observable in this sense of empirical evidence that we can all kind of gather around and agree as to what's happening right in front of us. So this focuses then, not surprisingly, on the observable, physical observable behaviors. And so when people were trying to get a sense of what's going on in terms of somebody's psychology, they were focusing just on what was outwardly observable. And remember, this is the mid 50s or the 1950s, so the middle 20th century. So they didn't have all these fancy brain imaging technology to figure out what was going on inside of a brain. So they really just stuck with what was kind of going on at the surface in terms of people's behavior. So mental things like the feeling of pain that people will report. You know, I stub my toe and I say, I feel pain. Well, according to behaviorism, pain, that feeling of pain, is really just nothing more than pain behavior. You know, me grabbing my toe that I just banged and saying the words ouch, and, you know, maybe jumping up and down as I balance while I'm trying to hold that injured foot. Similarly, this idea of love, this feeling, this strong emotion that seems to exist just in our minds, right? This feeling of love, according to behaviorism, is nothing more than just loving behavior. Maybe for reasons that they might be fairly obvious at this point, this has very much fallen out of favor, especially with the rise of modern neuroscience. We can focus on what's actually going on in the brain rather than just kind of looking at pain behavior. Um, so here's a different kind of physical monism, or just physicalism as they call it. It's physical identity. So this is where mental states are nothing more than specific physical parts of the brain. So here, rather than saying that pain is just the outwardly observable pain-associated behavior, instead we look at the neurons inside the brain that are associated with pain and say, like, that's pain, right? Those specific neurons, when they are active, those neurons are pain. Right? So there's the specific pain neurons, and the other, all the other mental things that we've talked about are identified as physical parts of the brain. And there's a variety of versions of this. I'll just mention these two kind of broad types. So there's the eliminative version, which is hard for me to say, that takes the really kind of hardcore physicalist approach here and says that these mental states that we've been talking about so far, they just don't even actually exist. It's kind of a myth or an illusion or a mistake to think that our internal, purely mental ideas, our mental states, that they are a thing in and of themselves. Instead, it's just the physical parts of the brain. That's it. Honestly, from my perspective, this one's kind of hard to accept because we go back to Descartes' original insight. I think, therefore I am. There's nothing I'm more sure of than the existence of my own mind. So to say that that's some kind of just mistake or an illusion, I need a lot more, a lot more that I'm not sure that the physicalists, this kind of eliminative version of physicalism is able to provide, like give an explanation for why it feels like we have these mental states when really it's nothing more than just the physical parts of the brain. A slightly softer version of this is the reductive version that doesn't just straightforwardly say that mental states don't exist, but instead it says that mental states are reducible to nothing more than the physical parts of the brain. I've got a whole lecture on reductionism in science, both reasons in favor of reductionism and reasons against reductionism. That might be worth checking out in order to get a deeper insight into what this reductive version of physical monism might be. Okay, as I've mentioned, this physical monism is very compatible with the contemporary scientific approach. So a lot of scientists, even if they really haven't thought much about what version, right, the eliminative version or the reductive version of physical monism that they accept, they still sort of, as kind of their default assumption, they accept some kind of physical monism, that they assume that our minds and our consciousness is completely explainable just in terms of the brain, the physical brain. Once we learn enough about how the physical brain operates on a physical level, we'll learn everything that there is to know about the mind and consciousness. Well, in that lecture that I mentioned about reductionism in science overall, I do offer some arguments against reductionism that include this stuff from philosophy of mind. In fact, I mentioned these things that are up here right now, that Thomas Nagel, in his famous essay, What It's Like to Be a Bat, argues that no matter how much scientific research we're capable of doing either now or into the future, we could get comprehensive understanding of the physical aspects of bat brains and their ability to use echolocation as their primary sensory system for understanding the world. So bat vocal cords and bat ears and how their bat brains process that auditory information as all those echoes come in from their environment. We could get a comprehensive understanding of all of that and still not really know what it's like to be a bat from the bat's perspective. So this is used as an argument against the idea that as long as we understand everything physical, then we're going to understand everything mental as well, that we can use our just purely physical understanding to have a complete understanding and explanation for the mind and for consciousness. The second one by Jackson says that he's got this famous story of this neuroscientist named Mary. And, it's very hypothetical, almost science fiction-y in a way. But we assume that she is raised in a grayscale room, right? So she never sees any regular colors at all. Presumably, she's capable of perceiving colors, but she never actually encounters any of them. And while she's growing up in this room, she learns everything that there is to know about the physical world, about photons and different wavelengths of photons, and how those photons interact with our photoreceptors and our retinas, and how that information is carried into our brains, how our brains process that information in order to build up an understanding of the world around us, and so on, similar to what we talked about with the bats. So Mary, the scientist, understands everything physical about visual perception. But then one day, somebody gives Mary an actual apple, right? A red apple. And so she sees the color red for the very first time. And the idea is she's just learned something new that she didn't know before, even though she knew everything physical, all the physical information about how eyes and brains work. Nevertheless, she learns something new when she sees the red apple. So this is taken, there's interesting debate over this one, but this is taken by Jackson as a reason against pure physicalism, that there's some knowledge that we can gain that is not knowledge about the physical. It's knowledge merely about the mental. And in this case, the mental knowledge we're gaining is what it's like to see red. Similarly, we can think about a colorblind person or a completely blind person. Could they ever really know what colors look like? It seems like not. They could do all the studying of science and its ability to study all the physical aspects of the universe as much as they want, and they will never know what the different colors look like. And there's also some animals that can see outside of our range of vision. So, the electromagnetic spectrum is gigantic. We only see a tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. But there's some animals that seem to be able to, well, they've got sensory systems that seem to be able to pick up on wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation that are outside what we consider to be the visual range, right? Whether it's ultraviolet or it's infrared. What do those look like? Even if we assume that things like blue and red and green look the same to those animals as the way they look to us, what does the color ultraviolet look like? Or what does infrared look like? What is try to imagine a color that you've never seen before, right? And that nobody's ever seen before. it doesn't seem like we can do that, right? And so we can't just change sort of our understanding of what's going on at the physical level in order to gain an understanding into some mental state and the perception of some color that we've never seen before. Okay, so moving on. To functionalism. So this is very similar to physicalism. It certainly is not substance dualism, right? It doesn't assume that there's this mental stuff or mental states that can exist separately from the physical. It's something that can be studied by contemporary science. So that's sort of a point in its favor. But it doesn't try to say that there's specific parts of the brain, right? It doesn't say that there's these specific neurons, these are the pain neurons. And when we talk about the feeling of pain, all we're really talking about is those specific neurons. Instead, this focuses not so much on the material of the brain, but the functions that that material is performing. So there's a wide variety of information processing functions that the brain is performing all the time. And so all of our mental states are identified as these functional states of the brain, right? These functions that the brain is performing. And so, as I say, it's not identical to specific kinds of matter. It's not specific neurons, but it does require specific neurons, in our case of our brains, specific neurons or networks of neurons to perform these functions. So if you get rid of the physical parts of the brain, then the mental part's gone because the functions are gone. The functions are not being performed anymore. But our mental states are the functional states of the brain, not the underlying physical substrate of the brain. So what that means is that any physical matter, it doesn't have to be neurons specifically, it could be any kind of physical substrate. As long as it's performing the same functions, then you're going to have the same mental state. So if we replace parts of our brain with electronic parts, and those electronic parts perform the exact same functions that our neurons were performing before the switch, then our mental states should be indistinguishable from what they were before because it's the same functions. So it does seem like that the functions our brain is performing are more important than the underlying physical substrate, right? The fact that it's specific neurons, that we could kind of switch the neurons around or maybe switch them out for electronic parts or some other parts that are performing the same function, and we wouldn't notice a difference, perhaps. You know, it's the same mental states. The arguments against tend to focus on this idea of different kinds of physical substrates performing the same functions. When we talk about electronic parts, we're used to electronics happening super fast, and we even talk about our computers as having little brains inside them. So that seems intuitively plausible. But if we really push this out further, we could talk about like a really incredibly elaborate gear and pulley system, with ropes and wooden gears and so on. That it's very complicated, but as long as it's performing the same functions that our neurons are performing, then the mental state should be the same, even though the physical substrate is radically different and probably far slower. And according to functionalism, it shouldn't matter what it's made out of as long as it's performing the same functions. But, people maybe start to hesitate when thinking like this elaborate gear and pulley system could have the same mental states that I have. Or a very highly distributed system. So we've got some parts of the function happening way over here, but they can communicate with parts of the system that are happening on a different continent, perhaps. But they're interacting in the right way so that collectively these distributed parts that exist throughout the whole world or even further afield, nevertheless, they're performing the same functions that are happening inside my brain. So there's these mental states that exist in this highly distributed system that are the same as the mental states that I'm having. Again, there's no fundamental way to prove that that can't be the case, but it's really kind of pushing people's intuitions to the breaking point in some cases. where they just might say, yeah, I just don't feel like that's possible, right? And unfortunately, when it comes to philosophy of mind, that's what a lot of the arguments come down to. Does it feel like this is possible? Does it feel like this is a possibly true account of what's really going on? Or does this just seem like it's stretching things too far and it just feels like it's impossible? It's a lot different than some of the other areas of philosophy that it's still not science, right? So we still don't have these kind of definitive arguments for or against. But nevertheless, philosophy of mind is particularly difficult when it comes to establishing arguments that kind of make a very, very strong and hard to deny case in favor or against any of these suggestions. Moving on. The last one we'll look at a little bit in any detail is emergentism. Very similar to functionalism, but it takes it perhaps even one step closer to substance dualism. Although again, like we're not talking about different substances, a physical substance and a mental substance that can exist separately on their own. Here we still have the mental side of things requires the physical in order for the mental to exist. But nevertheless, this is thinking, and it's similar to functionalism, but when the brain, the physical system, is performing these functions or doing its activity in whatever way, what emerges from this complex system is mental states. So it's kind of like the mental being the physical states of the underlying system, but it's going a little bit further. It's very hard to describe this in regular language, but something emerges. This is sort of like where the sum is greater than, or the total is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So you can look at all the different things that the brain is doing, that the underlying physical brain is doing, and put that all together. And there's this leftover something, the mental, that is also doing stuff at this kind of, so to speak, higher level, the mental level, that is not reducible to what's going on at the physical level. And if we're looking for one way of distinguishing emergentism from functionalism, this might be it. That in functionalism, everything that's happening at the mental level is associated with a particular thing that's happening at the physical level. But in emergentism, there can be things happening at the mental level that are not really reducible. You can't identify the specific thing that's happening at the physical level that accounts for that thing that's happening at the mental level. So the mental level's existing in some respect kind of independently. It's functioning a little bit independently than the physical, underlying physical part of things. But again, if you completely take away the physical side of things, then the mental side is going to just go away as well. Okay, so in favor, similar to functionalism again, it allows a large role from science. Perhaps if we have the right instruments, we can even use science to study these emergent properties, right? The emergent mind itself. So it's not a pure physicalism the way Nagel and Jackson were concerned about. But again, the causation of the mental is not fully explained. The mental really is this kind of independent thing that emerges from a physical system, but can then also causally interact with that physical system. What's the nature of that interaction? Sometimes this is referred to as downward causation, right? The mental is the stuff that's existing that can then cause things to happen at the physical level. And the physical, of course, causes things to happen at the mental level as well. But now we're back into this mysterious causation that's similar to the mysterious causation from physical dualism. I'm sorry, from substance dualism. A couple of others that you might see showing up in the literature on philosophy of mind. Epiphenomenalism. So an epiphenomenon is kind of a side effect of something. It's difficult to come up with good examples that really capture what people are thinking about as epiphenomenalism within philosophy of mind. One example that some people do give is a shadow. So my shadow, when I'm walking around on a sunny day, my shadow is not sort of its own thing. It's sort of a side effect of me being here, me, this real thing, being here blocking the sunlight. The sunlight is real. I'm real. And then there's my shadow down there on the ground, right? And the shadow isn't its own sort of really existing thing, so the idea goes. It's an epiphenomenon of this interaction between me and the sunlight. So the idea of epiphenomenalism in the philosophy of mind is that the brain is doing all the work, right? The brain is the real thing that really exists. And everything that we do is accounted for by the physical brain. But then there's also consciousness, so this is not an eliminative physicalism that says that mental states just don't exist, or that they're 100% completely reducible to nothing more than the physical. It says that these mental states do exist, but they exist as just kind of this side effect that doesn't have, in and of itself, the mental doesn't have any causal influence on the physical. So we certainly can talk in class about what you think about that one. Another interesting one is panpsychism. So pan, that prefix, like pandemic, it means it's everywhere, right? And so in panpsychism says that the mental, it's a little bit like substance dualism in that the mental is a fundamental part of the universe, but it doesn't have to be associated, in fact, rarely is associated with things like us. Sort of a fundamental part of the universe, kind of like mass or charge or spin, if you know about kind of the spin of electrons or other subatomic particles, sort of this fundamental property of the particles that make up the universe. So maybe mental stuff, right? Some kind of mental property exists in the universe. And so everything that exists has sort of a mental aspect to it, but most of the time it's pretty boring, right? So just a rock sitting there on the ground, it's got a mental aspect to it, the same way it's got mass associated with it and charge associated with it. But the mental properties associated with it would be pretty boring because a rock is just sitting there kind of doing nothing, really. It's only when we get to these complex systems like biological organisms when we start to get some kind of interesting mental activity going on. Even though, again, everything that exists in the world has some kind of mental property associated with it. Okay, I think we'll stop there and see you at the next